Here's a long-term review of the Seiko SBDX011, or Emperor Tuna, as it's typically known on the forums. Now, I've had this watch about 7 years. I bought it secondhand, but the first owner never really used it much. I've worn it quite a while over the last few years, and these are some of my observations. First, to start off, I like Tunas, and I have two others. I have a Darth, and I have the original 300-meter Tuna. These two are lighter, easier to maintain because they just run off a quartz they're quartz and they run off a battery, which when it's not a monocoque case, even I could change out. And they're just outright more practical on an everyday basis. And despite that, I prefer the heavier, bigger watch. I'd like to think I'm not that much of a movement snob after all of these years, but I guess the proof is in the pudding, and the fact that I continue to prefer this watch over these two says quite a lot. So I do think that ultimately is the draw for a lot of people with this watch. Even though it's heavier, it's heavy, it's expensive, and it's not the most practical, there's something really fascinating about it being an automatic in the same famous tuna can case. Another element for me is that this is a direct descendant of the original 6159. So to start off, as far as everyday use and the things I've experienced, the shroud is titanium and has survived pretty well over the years. Shockingly well. It needs to be removed if you're going to remove the bezel to clean it, and that's through these hex. You need a hex driver for that. Bezel, knock on wood to this day, is just about on the level of the Marine Master 600 I reviewed prior to that. Namely, very, very precise and very easy to use. The bezel insert has a laminate on it that you wouldn't even know exists, except on the Robert Marks Darth Tuna. Originally, this started to delaminate. I ended up getting a spare bezel and switched it out, but that really took me aback because I don't recall ever hearing anyone complaining about that. Well, it appears that this also has some sort of lamination on it, and knock on wood, I've not had any issues. So I have one up and one down. Quite possibly the Darth was just maybe some sort of factory defect, but I've not had any issues. The lume is, as is typical for Seiko watches, really, really good. Next, to go down into the dial itself. Now, the dial is basically, the Tuna dials basically are the same, except for either you're going to have a day date or you're not, and you're going to have the designation for water resistance. Other than that, they're basically the same dials. So if you have one in that respect, you have them all. If you're used to the Tuna dial, then you don't need to adjust to this. One thing you do need to adjust, and to some it may sound trivial, but on a day-to-day basis it actually isn't, is the bisection of the hour hand and minute hand. This bisection was on the original 6159, but the other Tunas, I'll bring them back again, don't have that. If you'll look at both of these, the hands aren't bisected. And again, this seems so trivial, but if you wear something like this for a while, you get used to it. And if you switch off to the bisection, it's really, really jarring and it takes a while to get used to. But after you get used to the bisection, it's really hard to go back to the non-bisection. I'm shocked that I'm mentioning this and it affected me so much, but I don't know if anyone else has gone through this, but that is my take. Overall, though, I've ultimately come to the conclusion that I prefer the bisected hands. So that's that on the hands. The movement is an 8L35, just like in the SBDX011 Marine Master. Knock on wood, it still keeps still has a good power reserve, and it still keeps time accurately. Though I imagine down the road it will have to be serviced. This is another monocoque case, which means the case back is one piece and it doesn't open, so you'd have to remove the shroud, remove the bezel, remove the crystal, and then pop the thing out, pop the dial out, and access the movement that way. I imagine it probably would have to go back to Japan, but I'm not sure, as I've not follow the latest updates. As far as the calendar, ultimately I prefer just a date without a day. Though I remember back in the late 2000s when I was just learning about tunas, it was such a big thing to have a Japanese date. But those times have passed, and I think the dial is just better balanced when it's just a date. As far as wearability, as I said before, it's a big, heavy watch. Though its main saving grace is it doesn't have lugs, so that makes it easier in that it doesn't have any overhang on your wrist. Originally, this came with Seiko's urethane strap, but I have a 6 3/4 inch wrist, and to be honest, it always felt as if it was too big. And the key thing with this watch is you can't really wear it loose, at least in my experience. If you wear it loose, it'll flop around, it'll move around, and it'll be very, very uncomfortable. So it's important that it fits fairly snug but comfortable. I've tried different straps, and eventually I gave up with commercial straps and I just made my own, which I'm happy with, and it gives me a very comfortable, snug fit. There are one or two black PVD bracelets that you could try to use, but I can't really recommend it because it makes a heavy watch that much heavier, and I really think it needs to be on your wrist snugly. So some sort of textile or urethane, I guess, if you have a larger wrist strap, I think would be the best way to go, or perhaps even NATO. That's really the gist of it, I would say. Overall, as I said in the beginning of the video, it's not, as far as tuna cans go, it's not terribly practical. But despite everything else and having it for all of these years, I still prefer it to the other tunas. Yes, it's heavier. Yes, it requires more maintenance in that it has an automatic movement. But there's something really, really cool about having an automatic movement in the classic tuna case, and the fact that it's a direct descendant of the original 6159. Obviously, your mileage will vary, but I really, really do prefer it this way. And again, it's not a knock on the quartz tunas. They're great watches in and of themselves, but I just still prefer this one, and it's held up really well over the 7 years of ownership. And if this is something that you have been considering buying, I would certainly recommend that. Once you get used to the size, it really is a great, cool watch. And that's about it for this video, and as usual, thanks for watching.